Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Obviously an incredible weekend. We've got Jennifer Lawless. She is the chair of the political science department at the University of Virginia. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, happy to be here.
Okay, so let's go over a couple things. Obviously there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, the former president of the United States and the Republican, all likely Republican nominee for president. Within an inch of potentially killing the former president. Lots of questions. Your first take on this, when you saw it, when you heard about it, and what you've learned since.
I was completely stunned. I'm still quite stunned, just because with the exception of when Ronald Reagan was shot, we haven't in my lifetime had the attempted assassination of a president. That's not to say, of course, that there haven't been horrible episodes of political violence, but when you think about these rallies and you think about presidential campaigns, I think we've all sort of just come to grips with the fact that security is incredibly heightened to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And so it's just not on the radar screen of most people. And so I was actually watching CNN the minute that they cut away to it, and it was stunning. And what we're learning now, 2 days later, is that there seem to have been major security breaches with, whether that's with the Secret Service, which is now being investigated, or the local police. There are a lot of unknowns, but this was certainly a situation where there was a counter sniper available and ready to go, which suggests that they were aware that a sniper was a real threat, yet he wasn't kept off that roof. So there are a lot of security questions. Obviously, the violence is devastating. The fact that former President Trump just had his ear grazed is good news, but there was a casualty, and there are 2 people that are still in very serious condition. So it's just stunning. It remains stunning.
I'm a little older than you, so as a small child, I do remember Martin Luther King being assassinated, Robert Kennedy, who was then a candidate, being assassinated, 2 attempts on Gerald Ford, and then the governor of Alabama, he was shot and paralyzed, Governor Wallace, as well. And of course, everybody remembers 1981, I believe it was, January of 81, when President Reagan was shot in Washington, D.C. We have sort of gotten lulled into it. As you start to peel this onion back, you find some distressing information, how difficult it is for the Secret Service to keep staff, a lot of turnover, incredibly demanding, worked, because of the shortage of staff, worked nearly all the time. Director Kimberly Chettle, who was brought in by President Biden just 2 years ago, had worked on presidential details, had been Vice President Cheney's security team during 9/11, and then later with Biden as Vice President and Obama. Lots of questions for her, and not a lot of information coming out of the Secret Service. What does that say about that culture, lack of transparency, and lack of information coming out of the agency?
Well, only 48 hours later, I actually think it's not a terrible thing that we haven't heard a ton of details, or that there's not complete transparency. If they just need a little bit more time to figure out exactly what went on, so that they can then convey to not only the American people, but also the administration and investigators where they think a ball was dropped, then I think that's fine. 4 or 5 days out with a complete lack of answers raises another question. But although it seems like it's been forever, it was only Saturday night that this happened.
Okay, let's go to the political realities of this. Former President Trump is now about to kick off the Republican National Convention. This is going to be, if we thought it might have some sparks with the naming of a vice president, it's got a lot more sparks coming out of it now. How does this GOP convention play out?
It's hard to know, because although the Republicans have certainly unified behind Donald Trump and generally condemned political violence, we are seeing a break already in their rhetoric. So there are potential VP candidates who have speaking spots at the convention, including J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr., who within minutes of the assassination attempt tweeted and blamed the radical left for this. And so I do think that there are going to be two sets of voices coming out of this convention. One that says there's no place in America for political violence and we have to unite to stop this. And apparently Donald Trump has rewritten his speech for Thursday night to make that point. And another, which is basically saying the left is to blame and they've, basically ginned up all of this fake news about how Donald Trump is going to end democracy, and these are the consequences of that. That's obviously not true. And it's crazy to think that they can inoculate the Biden campaign from condemning Donald Trump for his policy views, which in many ways would threaten democracy. But I do think that there is that disconnect between these two parts of the Republican Party. And although they might all be in one room in Milwaukee and they might all seem unified behind Donald Trump, my bet is that there are going to be two broad positions coming out of the convention.
Okay, let's go over to the White House. Joe Biden looked, I don't want to say knocked out, but certainly was up and being counted by the referee in the boxing match. This episode now resurrects, I'm not sure what the right term is from a political standpoint, his effort to be the Democratic nominee, he was obviously the odds-on favorite, but he's addressed the country 3 times now. He's looked presidential. Does this for Democrats end the debate if Joe Biden is going to be the nominee?
Well, look, first of all, he didn't just look presidential, he has been presidential. I think the speech last night, the address last night, was a masterclass in empathy, and he stopped short of saying, but the campaign is over, let's all just unite, right? He's saying that Americans have very, very deeply rooted differences in their views, but that we solve these problems by casting ballots, not by shooting bullets. And that's where he wants to unite the American people. But, he made it very, very clear that the campaign is going on, and the threats to democracy that Donald Trump and his campaign embody are real threats to democracy. That doesn't mean he should be assassinated. It doesn't mean there should be attempted assassinations, but it does mean that there's a very real campaign. And in fact, the Biden campaign's emails began again last night in earnest. As far as his likelihood of being the nominee, unclear. The last several days have obviously been a complete shock to the system. Party insiders are again this morning now beginning to talk about Nancy Pelosi working behind the scenes to see if she can get Biden out. But to be perfectly honest, the Joe Biden that the American people have seen over the course of the last few days is a Joe Biden that they will be comfortable, nominating and voting for. So, I don't know if this ends that discussion, but when people said that they wanted off the cuff real examples of the president being able to manage and lead, it's hard to envision a more important situation around which he's been leading than that in the last couple of days.
But isn't Joe Biden's problem not only the questions, is he able to lead right now? And he has demonstrated both he is and is not able to lead right now, depending on the day and the performance and his health and his mental faculties, but that there's an obviously deep concern by all Americans of what he will be 24 months from now or 48 months from now. And that's where Donald Trump has a supreme advantage of standing up after being shot and raising his hand in victory, saying fight, fight, fight. And depending on the day, Joe Biden is either looking or being presidential or looking and not being presidential.
I don't know that he hasn't been presidential. I think the main issue has been whether he has the stamina and the vigor to launch a campaign and to make it through November doing the things that he needs to do. Most of the criticism has not been about his ability to lead. It's been about his ability to campaign. And that hasn't changed. That remains an open question. One other thing I would note, though, is although the photo of Donald Trump with his fist in the air saying fight, 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 and the blood on his face will certainly become iconic, it's not being received universally as a positive thing, because what this means is that Donald Trump's version of being a leader is fighting the enemy. It's fighting the opposition. And he thinks about Democrats and Joe Biden as that enemy. And when he got up, his immediate reaction, it's in his DNA, is to take those people down, is to fight them. And in these circumstances over the course of the last 48 hours, I think that's been fine. I don't know if that's a message that is going to work to unify people the way that people now believe the country should be unified. So we'll see. I think the convention will tell us a lot. I think Donald Trump's speech will tell us a lot. And to be perfectly honest, I think if Donald Trump was giving a speech tonight, it might look a lot different than what he's going to give on Thursday night, because by Thursday night, the Republican base is going to be all excited. They're going to be ready to take it to Biden. It's not going to be just a couple of days after the assassination attempt. It's going to be, 5 or 6 days after. And my hunch is that the very sort of calm, cool, collected, unifying speech that Donald Trump allegedly drafted last night is going to undergo quite a bit of change by Thursday.
So based on those comments, are you seeing this event of Saturday night as being an event that will precipitate a lowering of the sort of toxic language on both sides and maybe unifying some portions of America? Or is this just another accelerant poured on sort of the division of America that ultimately will separate us and add to the agitation?
I'm not that optimistic about unification. I think that Democrats and Republicans alike agree genuinely that political violence is not appropriate in this country. And Republicans who may have been unwilling to call January 6th an event of political violence have now seen firsthand how political violence can trickle all the way up to the top of their ticket. So there might be among the rank and file some people whose views about that have changed. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, I think what we're going to see is both sides talk about how we need to bring the temperature down. Both sides talk about how cooler heads need to prevail and not actually walk the walk.
Isn't an X factor what the motivation of this 20-year-old was? He, 2 years out of high school, worked at a healthcare facility. His employer said he was a fine employee, functionally showed up every day and did his job. His classmates from his high school said he was kind of one of those victims of bullying. Not a huge, yet to date, unveiled political background, registered Republican, and may have given $15 to a Biden-related campaign entity. But as the FBI...
I don't know if it was a Biden-related campaign entity. It was a progressive campaign entity. It was a progressive organization.
Okay. So as the FBI goes into his phone, goes through his computer, finds out everything he has read and engaged in over the past 24, 36 months, isn't that going to be a little bit of an X factor of this campaign?
A little bit, but they interviewed some people that he went to high school with who said he was definitely conservative. I don't know. I think that the bigger issue is whether the way that we've been talking about politics in this country, the way that the political dialogue has been shaped, not even on this campaign, but over the course of the last 20 years, if that has created a set of circumstances where people might think that this is appropriate. Now, the reality is, fortunately, that it's very unusual for somebody to try and assassinate a political leader. And so I don't know that his motives per se are that important. I am going to be interested to see where the Republicans come down on guns and if this changes their general attitudes about weapons and whether you should be able to have an AR, style weapon available to you. It's unclear to me. I don't know where this is going to go in terms of policy. We're still at the point in time where I think everybody is a little bit shaken and stunned that this actually happened. But there are lots of layers of the onion to peel. And at the end of the day, by the time, if we find out his motivation, it's going to likely be quite a while from now.
Okay, last factor, which is you've hit on it, the House has already established an investigative committee that they're going to start digging into this immediately. The president has named that he's going to name a task force. Hopefully these two entities don't trip over each other and work independent and complementary to one another. How important is the findings of these two entities, and is it going to look like most everything else in our country? One's going to have one set of findings and look very political, and the other's going to have another set of findings and potentially look very political.
I think that it's unlikely, just because this is a very isolated incident. We know where the shooter was, and we know what Secret Service policy is. There was, coming out of Saturday night, some discussion about how, you know, Donald Trump, as a former president, wasn't given the same kind of Secret Service protection as an actual president, and that has been debunked. There's been, I would say, a pretty high level of attention to making sure that misinformation is not getting out there, and it seems like both of these entities are going to be investigating a very isolated incident that was captured entirely on film. So the circumstances are such that I think it's possible for both entities to arrive at a similar conclusion, or perhaps complementary findings that shed light on how this could happen and what policies should be in place to ensure that it doesn't moving forward. We also don't know if this was one person who made a mistake, or if this was a breach in broader policy, or if this is something systemic. These are the kinds of questions that need to be investigated.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it makes no sense that a rooftop just 400 feet away would not be secure in any way, shape, or form. A TikTok video was shown on CNN this morning for the first time at about 8:30 a.m. It was a different video than had been kicking around last night from some other attendees. This one showed a group of people yelling to the police from a different perspective. It clearly showed the shooter on. It was started more than a minute before the shooting transpired, and police functionally ignoring the people putting forth warnings. In addition, last night it was clear from those who were in attendance that the police had shimmied their way up, seen him, maybe been threatened by his weapon, and stepped down and away from the situation rather than engaging him. So there's a lot of going to be very significant questions about the role of police and the lack of coordination between Secret Service, Pennsylvania State Police, and local police officers, both county and within the town of, I believe, Butler.
I think that last point is really what's going to be a big focus of these investigations, because it's the relationship between the Secret Service and local law enforcement that on a daily basis keeps political leaders safe. So right. The Secret Service, we see the Secret Service who are, you know, in charge of the stage immediately jump into their positions and do everything that they were supposed to do once the shots were fired. The question is, why were the shots fired in the first place? And understanding the relationship between the Secret Service and local law enforcement, as well as coordination mechanisms, and whether that varies from one locality to the next, are things that, you know, typical people don't think about, but that are at the heart of all of this.
Well, and the question of how could a 20-year-old with a high school education be able to decipher what I would assume was a secret security plan, find the weaknesses of it, have the apparatus and ability to take a significant weapon, climb up on the roof of a building within the first 6 minutes of a speech, and get off multiple shots and almost kill the former president. I mean, you hate to go to conspiracy, but you have to wonder how a 20-year-old was able to do this by himself and not have the security plans.
Well, I mean, I think that whether he was a 20-year-old with a high school education, or if it was a 48-year-old with a college degree, anybody being able to pull this off, there are major questions. And the assumption that you are making is that, and this might be valid, we don't know, this is what they need to investigate, was that there was a very, very clear security plan that he was able to figure out how to get around. It could also be the case that that building was not secured or was not part of the plan. We just don't know. The counter sniper on the other rooftop suggests that there was an awareness of that building, but it was technically outside the perimeter. So these are the answers that, I think everybody's looking for. But more importantly are the broader procedures and protocols in place, because this environment, this actual setup, is never again going to be the site of a presidential candidate making a speech in this way. The question is, are there protocols and procedures and policies and security plans in place to prevent something like this from happening, regardless of how many tall buildings there are near an outside venue, regardless of whether there's a perimeter that extends beyond the magnetometers? And, these are the kinds of questions that both the House and the administration investigators are going to be looking at.
Is this the last time we're going to see a Trump rally in a county fair type environment with no, listen, as I understand snipers, a good sniper could hit that shot from a mile away. And so there's almost no way to secure a mile in all directions. Are these outdoor events just going to go away of the dodo bird?
I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because we're already seeing there aren't major protocol changes to the Republican National Convention, for example. I think that there's always been this ethos in American politics and among American political leaders that when we get knocked down, we get back up, and we're not going to cower behind fear. I wouldn't go and give a speech in a venue like that, but people running for president are not your typical candidates, or not your typical people. They're candidates. And so, I don't think it's the end of outdoor events. The other thing that's important to keep in mind here is, based on all of the people that were at the event, both rally attendees, but also other elected officials, the security was quite strong. And, getting into any of these Trump events, you do have to go through metal detectors. You do have to, open your bags. You do have to show all this stuff. So it's not like they're lax in security.
Within that constructed, right, but within that constructed area, which varies from venue to venue and is deemed appropriately, but we're talking about sniper attacks or other type of attacks like drones or other things that potentially could take place. Let me just go to sort of last question, which is, what should we be looking for this week at the Republican National Convention, the RNC, and what should we be looking for at the White House? Joe Biden may survive within the Democratic Party, but the word is that a lot of major givers, significant givers, have given up on Joe Biden and are going to put their money back in their pocket. So he may win the battle, but really lose the war. He is trailing in all of the 7 swing states now, as well as more states are coming into play, New Hampshire and Minnesota, et cetera. And maybe down, in the next 2 weeks, once the RNC bump happens, in 10 important swing states.
I don't buy it. And I don't mean that to sound like Joe Biden. I think
it sounds like Jill Biden, but that's okay.
If we look at the polls, obviously all of the polling was pre-Saturday night.
Right.
But if we look at the Fox News poll, if we look at the NBC poll, everything remains completely within the margin of error following 2 weeks of Joe Biden having what you cannot describe as anything other than the most disastrous 2 weeks in presidential political campaigns in recent memory. So I don't think that it's over. The margins of error in these swing state polls are also, larger than the margin of victory that Trump has. So I don't think it's over. What is going to be important is whether people who might have counted Joe Biden out are going to get back in fast if it is, in fact, that he's the nominee. I, too, have read about how there's $90 million in funding that's kind of frozen. If Biden is able to hold his own in the polls, if the course of the last several days have indicated to people that they feel comfortable with him and that he can, in fact, do the job not only as president but as presidential candidate, my bet is that money will unfreeze. The only thing that people want less than Joe Biden being the Democratic nominee is Donald Trump getting elected president of the United States. And if that ultimately is the contest and the discussion over replacing Biden comes to an end, my bet is that money is going to be freed up.
With that, Jennifer Lawless, professor at the University of Virginia, chair of the Political Science Department, as always, Thank you very much for your perspective and joining us. For everybody else, stay tuned. It is Monday. It was a non-stop news weekend, obviously. We'll have much more on all the national play, but obviously much more important to us here in Rhode Island, what's going on in Rhode Island. So stay tuned for much, much more. We'll have it all day and all night here at GoLocal. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.